She heard the gunshot before she heard the silence after it. Zuri pressed her back against the frozen dumpster, hand clamped over her mouth, lungs burning from air too cold to swallow. The alley reeked of grease and rust, and something metallic she didn't want to name. Chicago winter had a way of stripping everything down to what mattered: warmth, shadow, stillness. She'd been surviving on all three. Then the body hit the ground 3 feet from her. She didn't scream. Screaming was a luxury she'd lost somewhere around her second week on the streets. She just watched, pupils blown wide, as the man crumpled against the wet concrete, one hand reaching for something he'd never reach. The other man didn't move. He stood over the fallen body the way people stand in doorways, unhurried, certain, like he owned the threshold between life and what came after it. Mid-20s, jaw like cut stone. A coat that cost more than 6 months of the rent she no longer had. The gun at his side still exhaled a ghost of smoke into the frozen air. He wasn't supposed to see her. People like him never noticed people like her. That was the whole point. Invisibility was the only currency she had left. But his eyes cut through the dark like he'd been trained to find exactly the things that didn't want to be found. They locked onto her. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2. Long enough for every self-preservation instinct she had left to fire at once. Run, hide, beg, disappear. She did none of them. Her legs had stopped working the moment the gun went off. He tilted his head. Something moved across his face, not surprise, not threat. Something worse. Calculation. Do you want to keep living tonight? His voice was low. Quiet the way dangerous things are. Quiet, not absence of sound, but total control of it. He wasn't asking out of kindness. He was asking because her answer was going to determine something. She just didn't know what. Zuri looked at the man on the ground. She looked at the gun. She looked at his eyes, dark and patient and utterly unreadable. She should have said nothing, should have run the second her legs remembered how. Instead, she heard herself whisper, "Yes." And the corner of his mouth moved barely, just barely, and he slid the gun into his coat like it was nothing. Like men didn't die in alleys every night. Like she hadn't just witnessed something that people got killed for witnessing. "Then stay close," he said. "And don't ask questions yet." Yet, that single word told her everything. There would be questions, just not ones she'd be asking. She stood on shaking legs and followed a stranger over a body in the dark. And somewhere, beneath the fear and the cold and the desperate animal need to survive, a quieter part of her understood. Her old life had just ended. Whatever came next had already begun. His name moved through the black SUVs before he did. Zuri heard it first in the way the armed men straightened when he approached, not the stiff posture of soldiers following orders, but something older, more instinctive, the way bodies respond to gravity, to weather, to things that cannot be reasoned with. Luca Moretti. She learned the name the way you learn a burn after the damage is already done. He didn't explain himself on the walk out of the alley. He didn't apologize for the body he left behind, or the blood on his shoe, or the fact that he'd redirected the entire orbit of her night with a single question. He walked like a man who had never once second-guessed his own direction, and she followed because her options had narrowed to exactly one. The SUV was warm. That almost broke her. She hadn't been warm in 3 weeks. She pressed her knees together and stared out the tinted window as Chicago blurred past lit storefronts, empty intersections, the lake, somewhere black and enormous, beyond the skyline, and tried to calculate what she'd just stepped into. Street math, threat assessment. She'd gotten good at reading danger in the weeks since she'd lost everything. But Luca didn't fit any category she'd built. He sat across from her, watching. Not the way men on the street watched her, hungry, opportunistic, looking for a crack to wedge themselves into. He watched her the way you watch something you haven't classified yet. Careful, precise, like she was a variable he was still solving for. The penthouse was on the 53rd floor. It looked like the kind of place she used to see in magazines, at the laundromat, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass, the lake spread out below like hammered silver. Art on the walls that had probably never been touched. Furniture so clean it looked afraid of being sat on. It looked like safety. Her nervous system didn't believe it for a second. "You can stay here," Luca said. He'd crossed to the bar, poured 2 glasses of something amber, set one on the counter near her without pushing it closer. Like he understood the importance of not pushing. "For how long?" she asked. He looked toward the skyline. Something shifted in his jaw. A small tightening, quickly controlled. "Until the people who tried to kill me tonight stop thinking you're a weakness." Zuri let that sit in the air between them, tried to parse the layers of it. The people who tried to kill him, not who tried to hurt her, not who saw her as a target. He was telling her that she'd become collateral in a war she hadn't known existed 20 minutes ago, that strangers with guns now had a reason to know her name. She looked at the untouched drink, at the skyline, at the man standing in front of both, like he owned them equally. "You didn't ask if I had somewhere to be," she said. "You were hiding behind a dumpster in 8-degree weather." His voice carried no judgment. That was almost worse. "You didn't." She hated that he was right. She hated the way he said it, not cruel, not pitying, just factual, the way someone states the weather. She hated that the marble floor beneath her feet was warm, that her fingers were finally uncurling from the fists they'd made for 3 weeks straight, that some traitorous part of her body was already deciding this was shelter before her mind had agreed to anything. She picked up the glass. She didn't ask any more questions that night. She should have asked all of them. By the second morning, she understood what the penthouse really was. Beautiful things, Zuri had learned, were usually hiding something. The neighborhood she'd grown up in had beautiful murals on buildings with black mold behind the drywall. Her mother had been beautiful the morning she didn't come home. Chicago itself was beautiful. From the right angle, all glittering lake and steel skyline, if you didn't know where to look for the rot. The penthouse was the same. Security cameras at every corridor junction, angled to eliminate blind spots with the precision of someone who had thought deeply about being ambushed. Windows that didn't shudder in the wind, the way glass should, thick, reinforced, resistant to things she didn't want to name. Men at the elevator bank who nodded at her with the flat professional courtesy of people who were paid to be everywhere and noticed by no one. She wasn't a guest. She understood that by noon, a doctor arrived unannounced, unhurried, and treated the bruise along her ribs she hadn't mentioned to anyone. She hadn't even removed her jacket. He simply asked her to, the way doctors ask, and she'd been too exhausted to argue. He was efficient, kind, in a clinical way. He didn't ask how she'd gotten them. A woman named Sophia came later with clothes, real clothes, not the charity bin layers Zuri had been rotating for weeks. She laid them on the bed without ceremony and left without waiting to be thanked. The whole thing had the feeling of a system, practiced, refined, like Luca had done this before. That thought curdled in her stomach. She wore the clothes because she had nothing else. Luca himself stayed distant. She'd catch glimpses, a door closing, a low voice on a phone call that stopped when she passed. A profile against the window at 2 a.m. when she woke from a nightmare she didn't remember, but whose residue clung to her chest. He never crowded her, never checked in with the performative concern of someone who wanted credit for their generosity. He was simply present, everywhere and nowhere, a frequency she kept picking up against her will. On the 4th night, she found him on the balcony. The temperature had dropped again. He stood with his forearms braced on the railing, coat open, like the cold was irrelevant. Below them, the city breathed sirens somewhere distant, the lake invisible in the dark, the lights of the North Shore blinking like a code she couldn't read. She stepped outside. He didn't turn. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." A pause. She watched the slight rise and fall of his shoulders and tried to decide if she was brave or just tired of being careful. "Why did you help me?" she asked. The question had been accumulating since the alley. She could feel him consider refusing. It could see the refusal in the set of his jaw, the instinct to deflect, to stay behind the wall he'd clearly spent years building to regulation height. Then something gave. "Because I know what happens to girls no one protects. I learned that young." He said it quietly, no performance, no pause for effect, just the plain, worn weight of a sentence that had been true for a long time. Zuri looked at his profile, at the tension held in his jaw like an old scar, at the way he was staring at the city, the way people stare at things they feel responsible for. Luca Moretti wasn't just dangerous. He was carrying something, had been carrying it long before she arrived. She didn't ask what, not yet, but she stopped being afraid of the penthouse that night. She started being afraid of something much harder to survive: the feeling of wanting to understand him. The bullet hit the window at 11:47 p.m. She knew the time because she'd been staring at the clock on the microwave, unable to sleep, standing in the kitchen with a glass of water she hadn't touched. The sound was enormous and wrong, not the cinematic crack of movies, but something dense and physical. A concussive thud that drove the air from the room before the alarms found their voices. Glass didn't shatter. It spiderwebbed those reinforced panes, doing exactly what they were designed to do, but the impact was enough to drop Zuri to the floor before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Her body was faster than her mind. 3 weeks on the street had seen to that. Then Luca was there. She didn't hear him cross the room. He was simply not there, and then he was, low and fast, hand closing around her arm without hesitation, pulling her behind the kitchen island with a grip that was firm without being cruel. "Stay down," not a request, but not unkind either, a fact he was delivering in real time. The alarms were screaming. Through the floor she felt it, before she heard it: gunfire. Short, controlled bursts, the kind that meant trained men, not panicked ones. Below them, Luca's security was engaged. His enemies had found them. She pressed her back against the cabinet and watched his face in the strobing light of the alarm, and hated herself for what she noticed: that he wasn't afraid, not even close. He was calibrating, eyes moving, reading the room, accounting for vectors and angles and information she didn't have the vocabulary for. A man completely at home in the worst possible version of a situation. "Petrov's moving faster than I expected," he said. Someone sold him the address. "Who is Petrov?" "Someone who wants me to suffer before he kills me." He checked his phone, one glance, expressionless. He found something useful. She understood. Not the name, not the war, but the logic, the cold, devastating logic of it settled over her like ice water. She was the something useful. She thought about the doctor who hadn't asked questions, about Sophia and the clothes, about the way his men had looked at her since the first night, not like a person, but like an asset, something to be logged and monitored and kept intact. "I'm leverage," she said. Luca's jaw tightened. He didn't insult her by denying it. "You became leverage the moment you saw my face in that alley. That was always going to be true." He met her eyes. "The difference is whether you're leverage that's alive or leverage that isn't." The gunfire downstairs tapered. Silence expanded. His phone buzzed, and he read the screen, and something in his posture shifted, a millimeter of tension bleeding out. "It's clear," he said. He didn't stand immediately. For a moment he stayed crouched beside her, close enough that she could see the small scar bisecting his left brow, the careful blankness he'd constructed over whatever lived beneath it. "This won't stop," she said. "No, because of me." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes there and gone. A door briefly open. "Because of me," he corrected quietly. "You're just the reason they think they've found a shortcut." He stood and offered her his hand. She took it and felt, with absolute certainty, that she had just crossed a line she wouldn't be able to uncross. The attack changed everything. By morning, Luca had already started moving pieces. Viktor Petrov did not want Luca Moretti dead. That was the thing that kept Luca awake, that made his men uneasy, that turned a simple threat into something far more corrosive. Death was clean. Death was an ending. What Petrov wanted was operatic. He wanted Luca to lose something first, to understand what it felt like to reach for something and find only absence. Zuri learned this in fragments, the way she was learning everything about this world, from overheard conversations, from the tension in Sofia's hands when she brought meals, from the way Luca's men looked at each other when they thought she wasn't watching. Petrov was an arms dealer, had been for 15 years, had built his network across 4 countries and maintained it through a philosophy of absolute, theatrical punishment. He didn't just destroy enemies, he made their destruction a lesson for everyone watching. And 3 months ago, Luca had burned one of his most profitable supply routes to the ground. Not for territory, not for money, for reasons no one would explain to her. They moved to the safe house on a Thursday. A brownstone in a neighborhood that looked deliberately ordinary. Neat sidewalks, window boxes. The kind of street that made no one look twice. Inside, it was a different architecture entirely. The basement converted into a command room, lined with surveillance equipment, steel, reinforced doors. A basement, command room, rotation schedules for the 4-man team stationed outside at all hours. More guards, more structure, more of the suffocating, cotton-wrapped danger she was becoming fluent in. But proximity, she was discovering, was its own education. The closer she stayed to Luca, the more the mask slipped, not dramatically, not all at once, in pieces. The way he took his coffee, standing at the window, scanning the street below with eyes that never fully rested. The way he went silent for exactly 4 seconds after his phone rang before answering, like he was deciding something. The way he looked at her sometimes quickly, like a reflex, like his eyes moved to her before he decided to let them. She started noticing when he didn't sleep. He started noticing that she noticed. "You watch people like you're cataloging them," he said one night. They were in the kitchen again. It had become an accidental ritual. 2 people who couldn't sleep, gravitating toward the same lit room. "Survival habit," she said. "From before the streets?" She measured the question he'd never asked about before. She'd never offered. "From always," she said. He accepted that. Didn't push. Just turned his mug in his hands and looked at the table. And she thought, not for the first time, that whoever had taught Luca Moretti about the kind of silence that gives people room to breathe had done him a profound service. "Petrov won't send men again," he said eventually. "Not directly. He'll wait. He'll look for a moment when your guard is down and mine is split." He looked up. "He's patient." "And you?" Something crossed his face. Almost wry. Almost. "I'm learning to be." She understood, with a clarity that arrived quietly and sat very still, that he wasn't just talking about Petrov. The real danger had never been the man with the guns. It was this: a kitchen at 2 a.m. A man who made space instead of taking it. The way her chest had started doing something complicated every time he looked at her, like she was worth being careful with. In his world, caring got people killed. She was starting to understand that she didn't care about that nearly enough. 16 days in the safe house. She counted them like a sentence being served, and on the 17th morning, she made a decision that she knew Luca wouldn't like. She was done hiding. Not recklessly, she wasn't suicidal, and she hadn't forgotten what happened to people in Petrov's path. But there was a particular kind of slow violence in being protected that nobody talked about. The way it eroded you, the way being kept safe by someone else's strength could quietly dismantle your own, turn you into a thing that needed keeping, a passive object in a story happening entirely around you. Zuri had been many things: broke, hungry, alone, invisible. She refused to be passive. She found Luca in the command room, standing over a table of printed maps and surveillance photographs, one hand braced on the edge, reading something with the focused stillness of a man who'd taught himself to store urgency internally rather than wear it. "I want to help," she said. He didn't look up. "No. I was on these streets for 3 weeks alone. I know how to move through neighborhoods without being tracked. I know which corners have cameras and which don't, which businesses are fronts, which people are watching for money." She let that land. "You have men who know this world from the inside. I know it from the bottom. That's a different angle." Now he looked up. She held his stare, made sure her hands weren't doing anything nervous. "You don't understand what you're asking to step into," he said, controlled. No condescension, but the weight of someone who understood the cost of the thing she was treating like a decision. "Then stop keeping me ignorant of it." She moved to the table, looked at the photographs, faces, locations, timestamps. "You said I became leverage the moment I saw your face. You can't unleverage me by hiding me. That just makes me a liability instead of an asset." The room was quiet. One of his men near the door shifted almost imperceptibly. Luca's eyes hadn't moved from her face. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the second night." Something happened in his expression, not softening exactly, more like adjustment, the recalibration of someone updating a calculation. "I told you you were a problem," he said quietly. "You said I was something to be solved." She met his eyes. "Solve me differently." The silence stretched. She counted her own heartbeats. 4, 5, 6. "You follow every instruction without question," he said finally. "You stay inside the perimeter unless I specifically move it. And the moment something shifts, I listen. Without argument." "Without argument," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment more, and she saw it then. The thing he was trying not to let her see. Not doubt, not reluctance. Something far more unsettling. The first full evidence that he trusted her. "Fine," he said. He turned back to the maps. She stepped up beside him and looked down at Petrov's territory, laid out in ink and paper, and felt something harden in her, not anger, not ambition, but the bone-deep decision of a woman who was done letting the world happen to her. She was in this now. All the way in. The plan was clean. That was the word Luca used, clean. A fake exchange. A warehouse on the south side that Petrov's people had been surveilling for 2 weeks, which meant they'd expect it, which was exactly what Luca needed them to do. He'd fed the location through 3 layers of deliberately leaky intelligence, let the word reach Petrov's network like something valuable being poorly guarded. The trap wasn't the warehouse. The trap was the belief that Luca made mistakes. Zuri ran the perimeter with Marco, one of Luca's senior men, quiet and methodical, who had accepted her presence with the resigned pragmatism of someone who'd learned not to question the boss's decisions. She knew her role: secondary eyes, ground-level intelligence, a presence no one would register as a threat. For 40 minutes, it was clean. Then the south entrance exploded. Not figuratively. Actual fire, a blast that blew the corrugated door inward and turned the warehouse's careful geometry into chaos in under 3 seconds. Petrov hadn't taken the bait. He'd reverse-engineered it. He'd known about the trap and set a counter-trap, and the elegance of it, the cold, patient intelligence of it, was almost admirable in the half-second before everything became noise. Gunfire from 4 directions. Not Petrov's men walking into an ambush. Luca's men, suddenly surrounded in one. She lost Marco in the first 30 seconds. She moved on, instinct low, fast, using the burning wreckage as cover, thinking in the stripped-down arithmetic of immediate survival that the streets had installed in her like a second operating system. Exit points, movement patterns, where the fire was concentrated versus where it wasn't. She was almost at the east wall when the bag went over her head. She never saw the second team moving behind the smoke. Hands multiple, organized, prepared for her specifically, and then the cold air was gone, replaced by rough fabric and the smell of exhaust and the sound of a vehicle door. Professional, precise, patient. Petrov's men hadn't come for Luca. They'd come for her. In the terrifying stillness of the moving vehicle, zip ties at her wrists, she made herself breathe slowly and think clearly. The way Luca had shown her without meaning to, the way he modeled composure not as the absence of fear, but as the management of it. She was what Petrov wanted alive, which meant, for now, she was worth more breathing. She held on to that. In the warehouse, she knew the smoke was still clearing. She knew Luca's men were regrouping. She knew that in approximately the time it took for radio contact to be re-established and the scene to be read, he would know she was gone. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, exactly what that knowledge would do to him. Good, she thought, fiercely, terribly. Come find me. The message came through a number that had never been used before and would never be used again. 4 words. Come alone, or don't. Attached, a photograph. Zuri, zip-tied wrists. Still, somehow, looking directly at the camera, like she was memorizing the face behind it. Luca looked at the photograph for 6 seconds. His men were talking. Marco was briefing him on the ambush, how it had been orchestrated, where the intelligence leak might have originated, what their defensive options were. 3 of the senior team were already running scenarios. Someone had pulled up a satellite map of Petrov's confirmed properties. There was a whiteboard. There were voices that kept calibrating toward reason, toward strategy, toward the cold professional arithmetic of minimizing losses. Luca set his phone face down on the table. The room quieted. What's the fastest route to the Canaryville warehouse? He asked. Silence. Boss. Marco's voice was careful, measured, the tone of a man who understood something was happening and had made a tactical decision to speak anyway. It's a setup. The moment you walk in there, alone, I know what it is. Then you know he's counting on this. He wants you emotional. He wants you to make the call that ends you. He's going to get what he wants, Luca said. Quiet, absolute. The question is whether he correctly predicted how it ends. The room didn't argue. That was the thing about men who had followed Luca long enough. They'd learned the texture of his certainty. They knew the difference between recklessness and the particular focused stillness of someone who had already decided and was now simply in motion. He went alone, technically. Marco and 6 others were already repositioned before the SUV left the safe house. Old routes, no radio. The kind of quiet parallel operation that Luca had never had to explain because his team had been built to anticipate exactly this moment. The Canaryville warehouse was the same geography as the alley where he'd first found her, the same cold, the same rotting brick, the same Chicago winter pressing down like something with intent. He walked in through the front. No pretense. Petrov would have eyes on the perimeter, would know the second he arrived, and deception wasn't the point. The point was presence. Petrov was standing near the back 60, heavy-set, wearing the particular expression of a man who expected fear and had prepared a response for it. Zuri was to his left, seated, hands bound. A man behind her with a pistol angled toward the back of her chair. Her eyes found Luca the moment he entered, and something crossed her face relief, then immediately, something harder. I knew you'd come. And underneath that, visible only because he had spent 17 days learning the specific language of her face. Don't do anything stupid. He almost smiled. You came, Petrov said. You asked. I expected to have to wait longer. Sentiment slows men down. It clarifies them, Luca said. He didn't reach for a weapon. He stood with his hands open, and Petrov, who had built his career on reading threats, frowned at the wrongness of it. The man across from him was not behaving like someone who had walked into a trap, which meant either Luca was broken by what he'd walked into, or he hadn't walked into it alone. The first of Marco's team, came through the skylight at the exact moment Petrov reached that conclusion. The rescue became a reckoning. Petrov had been prepared for a desperate man. He had built the entire night around the architecture of Luca's attachment, weaponized it, constructed a scenario so perfectly calibrated to Luca's emotions that it functioned like a trap within a trap. Come alone, come compromised, come human. What he hadn't prepared for was Zuri. In the 3 seconds between Marco's team breaching the skylight and the room collapsing into gunfire, she moved. The man behind her had turned toward the threat above, which was his mistake, a single degree of inattention, and she was already using it. Hands still bound, she drove her elbow back with everything she had, felt contact, went low, and was on the ground and moving before he could recover. She'd learned from watching Luca. She hadn't understood until now how completely she'd been absorbing it. The fight was short, brutal. The kind of violence that had none of the operatic quality of movies, just the grinding, efficient erasure of resistance by men who had done this enough times to remove everything superfluous. Petrov's organization had been eroding for months. Luca had seen to that, and tonight was the conclusion of a war of attrition that had been building long before she'd ever hidden behind a dumpster in the dark. When it was over, the warehouse held only smoke and aftermath. Petrov's empire didn't collapse overnight. These things never did. But the network fractured. Without its center supply routes, went dark. Lieutenants defected or disappeared. The careful machinery of fear that Petrov had maintained for 15 years began to seize without his hand on it. Luca's men worked the dismantling over the following weeks with the quiet thoroughness of people finishing something they'd started long ago. The war ended not with a declaration, but with silence. The particular silence of a thing that had stopped moving. But that wasn't the change Zuri was watching. She watched Luca instead. She watched him in the days after moving through the penthouse again, back at the window above the lake, running his city with the same composed authority he'd always had, and slowly, unmistakably, differently. Small things. He laughed once briefly, genuinely, at something Marco said, and the surprise on Marco's face told her everything. He stopped checking his phone during meals. He asked her opinion on things, small things, then larger ones, in the incremental way that trust expands when it's being built by someone who spent a long time believing it was a liability. One night, he found her on the balcony. It was cold. She'd gone out anyway. He stood beside her, not behind her, not across from her. Beside. She felt the heat of him against the winter air and said nothing and let the lake do its dark, enormous work below them. I grew up with a sister, he said. She didn't move. She was 4 years younger. She had a thing for staying invisible, thought if she made herself small enough, the things that hurt her would stop noticing her. A pause. The lake reflected nothing. It didn't work. Zuri understood why he'd helped her in the alley. Understood it completely and finally. The full shape of it, the grief and the guilt and the need to make something come out differently just once. What was her name? She asked. Elena. She didn't ask for the rest of it. She could hear it in the single syllable, the weight of a name that had become a wound. She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at her. He'd given up pretending he wasn't. I'm still here, she said. Not I'm sorry. Not I understand. Just the plainest, truest thing, a fact she was offering him like something he could hold. Something in his face came undone. Not dramatically. He didn't collapse or reach for her or say anything that would have been too much. He just let it happen, let her see it, the thing beneath all that beautiful, dangerous composure. The grief and the vigilance and the terrible, inconvenient tenderness of a man who had tried very hard to want nothing. You're going to be a problem, he said. His voice was rough. You said that already. I keep being right. She looked back at the lake. He stayed where he was. Neither of them moved away. Below them, Chicago breathed in the dark, indifferent, relentless, alive, the same city that had tried to swallow her. The same cold that had made breathing hurt the night a stranger found her and asked one question that changed the shape of everything. Luca Moretti had saved her from a night that would have killed her. What he hadn't accounted for, what all his surveillance and strategy and carefully constructed distance hadn't protected him from, was this: she had saved him too. From the version of himself that had stopped believing anything was worth the cost. The most feared man in Chicago stood on a balcony 53 floors above the water, and for the first time in a very long time, he had something to lose. He looked like he'd decided it was worth it.